Hey guys, welcome to week 8. In week 8, we are going to take a look at the digestive and urinary system. I cover both of these chapters together because in both of the chapters we're looking at how we take in nutrients and liquids and how we absorb those by our body, and then we're going to take a look at then how we process the waste products that result from those two different processes, and then what we do to eliminate those waste products. So that's what we're going to look at here. And in this video you guys are looking at the digestive system, which is chapter 23. So I'm going to go ahead and take a look at the PowerPoint. Let me share my screen with you here so we can go ahead and get rolling. Okay. All right, guys. So again, chapter 23, looking at the digestive system. So in this chapter, we're going to take a look at the basic anatomy and physiology of the digestive system. So we're going to first take a look at the 4 functions of the digestive system. So a lot of times we think that digestion is the only thing that this system does, but we're also going to talk about how we take in these nutrients and how we absorb these nutrients in different parts of our digestive tract. So we'll talk about that first. We'll then take a look at the processes of digestion and absorption. We'll look at the 4 different layers of our gastrointestinal tract, is another name for our digestive tract. We'll look at the nerves and membranes involved as well. We are going to look at the structure and functions of the organs as well as the accessory organs of our digestive system. And I actually have a labeling diagram we'll go through in this chapter as well, as usual. So starting with first, we have 4 functions of our digestive system: ingestion, digestion, absorption, and excretion. So that's what we're looking at here. So we're talking about how the process takes place. We know that in order for us to get the nutrients that we need, we have to eat the food, right? We have to eat these nutrients. We have to eat things like carrots and grains and things that are healthy for us because they're things that are needed by our body. So the first step is ingestion. So that's the ingesting of our food there. Then what we do is we then digest that food. So today we'll talk about how once we swallow food, what's going to happen. We'll follow it through the pathway of our digestive tract. We'll take a look at how in each different organ that this food makes its way to, there's different things that are taking place. One, we have mechanical digestion taking place, which is the physical movement of the food through our digestive tract. The actual churning and mixing that takes place within our stomach is helping to break that food down. It actually begins in the mouth. Chewing of our food is very much a part of digestion because we are chewing it up to make it smaller. We are mixing it with different fluids in our mouth, and that makes it not just easier to swallow, but immediately starts this process of digestion. And then there's the chemical digestion. So besides just the physical movement, the mechanical movement that's taking place, we'll take a look at how there's a lot of different chemicals involved in this process. And I just talked about what's happening in our mouth with chewing, but mixing with that saliva actually contains a lot of enzymes that are going to help to break down food right away. As soon as we put it into our mouth, saliva is immediately starting to break that down. And when I say break it down, we'll talk today about how, we know that there are a couple major food groups that we take in. We may be familiar with carbohydrates, things like breads and grains, fruits. Those are all really important carbohydrates. We'll get into a little bit later. We'll talk about the nutritional aspect of it and how there's a big difference between simple carbs and complex carbs. Simple carbs are your more sugary based things, white breads, pastas, obviously cookies and candies and things, and they're simple carbs. Complex carbs, which is more of your fibers and grains and things of that nature. When I say end product, what happens is when I take in those types of foods and break them down, they immediately are going to be converted to our body to something that can be processed and absorbed by our body and used for energy. Carbohydrates, we'll learn when you guys take nutrition, you will learn this a little bit further, but carbohydrates are actually our first source of energy. That's what our body's looking for in order to burn for that energy. And what carbohydrates become is glucose becomes glucose in our body, which we know, we're familiar with glucose. Glucose is our blood sugar, and that again eventually will be used for energy. So that's what I mean when I say digestion. We're taking these large food molecules, and I use carbohydrates as the example. Proteins will eventually be broken down into amino acids, and fats will be broken down into fatty acids and triglycerides. Um, but that's what I mean by there. It's just we're taking these large food molecules and breaking them down into something that can be better absorbed by the body and utilized. Eventually, we will eliminate things that are waste products from this digestion. But that's what we're doing, is we're breaking these things down. And so that's what I mean by the mechanical, which is again the physical movements, and then we'll see chemical, which is the mixing with different chemicals all along the pathway. So I began with saliva, but we'll talk about how there's other chemicals in the stomach, small intestine, all kinds of things that are going to help. So we'll get into that. The third function of our digestive system is the absorption. So again, as I mentioned, we eat healthy foods for a reason. There's a reason why we need to eat more vegetables and fruits and things of that nature, as opposed to just cookies and candies all the time, because these nutrients are going to be absorbed by our body and utilized, and it helps us to function better. So again, you'll take a whole separate class based on nutrients, and you'll learn why calcium and vitamin D is really important to make your bones stronger. You'll learn that vitamin A is something that's a very essential nutrient for your eyesight. Things like that. That's going to show that these nutrients are there to serve a purpose. So our nutrients are absorbed, and we'll show where that happens in our digestive tract today. And the last thing we'll look at is how then it's excreted, how it's eliminated. We remove everything that isn't absorbed by digestion. Anything that's a waste product, then that is going to be removed in defecation. So we'll get into that whole process. Okay, so that all of those functions, again, those are our 4 functions of the digestive system. So again, your digestive system, your digestive tract, also known as the gastrointestinal tract or GI tract, and sometimes may be referred to as the alimentary canal. If you ever hear these things, they're just synonyms for the digestive tract. But what the digestive tract is, it's a way to think about it, is really just one long tube that just, if you think about it, it's just real long. It starts at the mouth and ends at the anus, and that's what it is. It's just this food is following this pathway through this tube. Eventually, again, maybe we're absorbing some things out of this food along this pathway. We're mixing with some different fluids to help break it down. Again, like I said, we're absorbing the nutrients from it, absorbing some water from it, and then eventually will become waste product, and we will remove the rest of it, is a way to think about it. So I mentioned that it starts at the mouth. So this is, just kind of an overview of our digestive system here. So starting in the mouth, we're going to see a lot of different accessory structures here, including our salivary glands. And then again, our teeth are going to serve an important purpose here. We'll swallow, go down the esophagus. The esophagus takes it to the stomach. The stomach will then move to the small intestine. The small intestine is going to move to the large intestine, and eventually we'll move to the rectum and then out through the anus. So that's kind of the short and sweet of it. Along the way, we're going to see different accessory structures like the liver, you can see here in this picture, which sits outside of that tube that I'm referencing as our GI tract. But there are going to be some chemicals that come from the liver that's going to go right through this tube and go directly into the small intestine. That's going to help aid in that process of digestion. So we'll see all of those as we follow this pathway. So I want to start by looking at the layers. So before we start identifying all of the different parts of the digestive tract, there are different layers along, if we were to cut open, say, the small intestine and look into the inside of it, you would see that there are 4 layers to the digestive tract. One we might already be familiar with. If you remember when I was talking about our smooth muscle, when we talked about muscle in our muscular system chapter, we talked about how smooth muscle is involved in movement, as all muscle is, but smooth muscle is involved in movement of different organs, including the digestive tract. that food has to be able to move through the digestive tract. So there is a layer of muscle tissue that's going to slowly contract to help push our food forward. Everything else that you're looking at here, we have a mucosal and a submucosal layer, which is just the inner lining. So again, it is a mucus-based layer, tubing to allow things to smoothly, flow through the digestive system here. So we have a mucosa layer, and then the layer just beneath that is the submucosa. It is the next layer that is that muscle layer. You can see the layers of muscles that are contained here in this layer. Like I said, we're looking at, it looks like a cut picture of either the small intestine, it actually looks like that's what we're looking at here. The muscle layer, when it says that it's made up of different circular and longitudinal muscle layers, those just show that the patterns of this muscle kind of go in different directions. But again, it's the collective contraction of this muscle that's going to help to push food forward through our digestive tract. You don't have to worry about circular versus longitudinal muscle or the difference between the two. But it's this muscle that's going to help provide that mixing and mashing action that's going to move that food forward. So it's very much a part of that mechanical digestion we were just talking about. We're also going to see what's called peristalsis taking place. I don't remember if I mentioned this to you guys in our muscular system chapter, but when we talked about smooth muscle, we may have mentioned this. The process of peristalsis is these slow wave-like contractions that are actually going to take place. And when I say wave-like, I mean that we've got a contraction in one part of the small intestine, then the next, then the next, then the next, and it kind of moves in that kind of, wave. And what that does is it slowly helps to push that food forward. We see a little bit of peristalsis taking place in our arteries too. That's going to be what helps to move blood forward. But we'll see peristalsis also happening in our urinary system, moving urine from the kidneys down to our bladder as well. So that's what that is. When you hear the term peristalsis, it's simply just wave-like contractions of that smooth muscle. And what's also involved here is our nervous system. We'll talk a little bit about what's called the enteral nervous system, which is just the control of our digestive organs here. So we'll see there's nerves involved here, and that's what's going to be where our brain is signaling, the movements of this muscle to make sure it's doing its job. It's, again, something we do not have to think of. It's part of that autonomic nervous system. If you remember, the autonomic nervous system was our nervous system that happens automatically. Remember, we associated those two words, and this nervous system is a part of that. So we'll get into that a little bit later. The last layer is called the serosa, or the serosal layer, which is just made up of what's sometimes referred to as the peritoneal membranes. Your peritoneum is simply just the name given to the membrane that surrounds your digestive organs and your that abdominal layer down there in your abdomen. So this outside layer is, you can refer to as the serosa, or again, you can refer to that as the peritoneal membranes. If I ask you guys something about that, that's what that's referring to, is just that outer layer. So those are your 4 layers of our digestive system: the mucosa, the submucosa, the muscle layer, and then you have the serosa. All right, so I mentioned that I would briefly mention the enteric nervous system. Again, this is what's part of that autonomic nervous system. Again, is something that is very much automatically controlled for us. We do not have to think about it whatsoever, but it is simply going to be what regulates that gut motility and secretion. So it's in control of our digestion. It's going to be the signal that comes from our brain telling us when it needs to contract and when it needs to, again, start moving that digestion forward. We know that, again, the autonomic nervous system is controlled based on whether we're in a high stress state or not. So remember, we talked about, not that you guys have to know this, but just as a refresher, that there was the sympathetic nervous system and the parasympathetic. Your digestion mostly is going to be very active when you're in that non-stress state, when your parasympathetic nervous system is in control. In a very high stressed situation, so something that's very fight or flight, what happens is digestion actually slows down. When the sympathetic nervous system is active, it is focusing on controlling the heart rate, getting that breathing so that the person can intake more oxygen in that high stress state, whether it be, again, some type of adrenaline rush situation where they're in fight or flight mode, or even an exercise state. That digestion is actually going to slow down until we get out of that fight or flight mode. So just kind of fun fact there. But that's the enteric nervous system, just the control of our gut. All right, guys, so here is our overview. This is our labeling for this chapter. You all have a very similar picture in your book, I would guess. I know that you guys do, but in this one, I like this one because it does give not just the small intestine and the large intestine like that previous picture did, but it breaks up the different parts of each. So actually, in your all's text, your all's is just broken down into multiple pictures, and we will get into each of those as we get into our, I'm sorry, you have a similar picture on page 433, but your book does go into then individualized pictures. When we talk about the mouth, we'll see a picture of the mouth. When we talk about the large intestines, we'll see just a picture of the large intestines. So the reason why I like this picture a little bit more than the one on page 433 is just because, again, what we're going to see, the small intestine actually has 3 parts. Just like if you remember from our respiratory tract, remember how the pharynx had 3 parts? Very similar to something we're seeing here. And this diagram labels all 3 parts. So I like this picture a whole lot. So we're going to go ahead and label this, and then what I'll do is we'll walk through each of the different parts of this digestive tract as we go through the rest of the lecture. So first thing you're seeing, we know that digestion begins in the mouth. So it's not labeled for us here, but we know that the mouth is located right up here. And then what happens is we're going to chew up that food. Chewing helps to make it smaller, helps with digestion because of our salivary enzymes that are present there in the mouth. What we'll do is we will then swallow that food, which we'll later see is the process of what's called deglutition, is swallowing. Deglutition takes place, we know when we swallow, those muscles are going to force that epiglottis to shut over top of the trachea so that food will pass through the pharynx and then go right into the esophagus. So hopefully that's a similar term for you guys, as we saw that last week when we were talking about the process of, the passaging of air. Here we're going to look at food. So there's where that esophagus is now going to come in. So number 1 is the esophagus. So food is going to then travel down the esophagus and is going to be deposited directly into the stomach. So number 2 is the stomach. And both of these are labeled for you on your all's diagram there on page 433. It's when we get to this next structure. So actually, the next part, so when food comes out of the stomach here, so there's my cursor there, you can see that when it comes out of the stomach, it's actually going to go directly into the small intestines. Now, number 3 is not pointing to just small intestine. It's actually the first part of the small intestine. So numbers 3, 7, and 8 are those 3 different divisions. If we were to take, the small intestines out and stretch it all the way out, the small intestines are about 20 feet, I believe. I can't remember. They're long. It's very long. So the small intestines can be divided into different sections, and that's easier definitely for clinical reasons to make sure we know the different sections of that small intestine. So you don't have to know how long each section is. I believe this first section is only the first foot, but just know that it's in this order. So the first part, number 3, is pointing to the duodenum, or sometimes people say duodenum. Let me see. I'm going to see if I can point out in your book where the spelling of that is. I mean, I can tell you. It's D-O-U, so think duo. D-O-U. D-E. I'm not very good with spelling unless I'm writing it down. You guys, I'm sure have learned that about me already. Oh, did I already say? I already messed it up. See, I had to write it down. D-U-O. I know I said D-O-U. I'm so sorry. D-U-O, because it's duo, and then D-E-N-U-M. So the duodenum. Sorry, guys. I want to see if there's a spot in your book. It is in your book. I just found it after I wrote that down, of course, on page 441. That is where we're going to begin to talk about the small intestines. It is going to be on your PowerPoint too. My apologies. The second section, so what number 7 is pointing to on your diagram, is called the jejunum. So Jejunum. Jejunum. And then the last section is ileum. So you can see these different terms in blue in your book. Ileum, ileum. So that is all the small intestine. That's the next stage of digestion. It's going to move through that small intestine. Now, some people say that they remember DJI to remember that the small intestine. And that helps them to remember the duodenum, jejunum, ileum. All right. So you might be wondering why we went from 3 to 7. Numbers 4, 5, and 6 are all actually outside of this digestive tract. They are considered what's called accessory structures because they aren't part of this one long tube that we are referring to as our GI tract or our digestive tract. They sit outside of it, but their secretions are going to go directly into this first section of the small intestine here, right there at number 3, what we call the duodenum. Their secretions are going to go right into that portion and help with this digestion. So we'll talk about each of these structures a little bit later and what they do, but let's go ahead and label these. Number 4 is pointing to the liver. So you guys can see this on your all's diagram, the one that, that's the overview on page 433. The liver is pointed out for us there. A big old organ, so hopefully not too tough to miss there. Underneath the liver is going to be something that kind of helps out the liver. Number 5 is the gallbladder. And then number 6 is an organ we're already familiar with because of its endocrine functions, but today we're going to talk about its exocrine functions and digestion. So number 6 is the pancreas. And all of those all labeled for you there. All right. Then we're going to move into, so from the small intestine, as well as, again, we have those secretions that are going to come into the small intestine right there to help with digestion. But we are then going to move into the large intestine. So the large intestine starts at number 9. Number 9 is what's called the cecum. I'm trying to see if where we're talking about the large intestine in the book. Page 442. I know that one that's on page 433 only labels that as the large intestine, but just like the small intestines, there are different divisions of the large intestine here, and that's what we're going to label as we go through this section here. And we will point all of these out in the PowerPoint too. So number 9 is the cecum. Number 10, not really having anything to do with digestion, but since it's right there next to the cecum, we're going to go ahead and point that out. That is the appendix. So the appendix, is that labeled for us there? It is not, but we'll go ahead and spell that. It is not on that main diagram, but it is in the section where we talk about the large intestine. It is APPENDIX, appendix. And then numbers 11, 12, 13, and 14 are all part of what's called the colon. Your large intestine is oftentimes referred to as the colon, but all 4 of these structures are all going to end in the word colon. There's a different word in front of each of these, but they're all going to be the something colon. Number 11, so if you think about it, food will travel from that cecum and is now going to go up this section before it moves across the next section and then down that final section there. So the names we're going to be given, a way to think about it is the way that the food is moving and what direction it's going. Number 11 is called the ascending colon. So again, because food is going to ascend through this section of the colon, that's one way we can think about its name there. So think about ascending, it's going up, so it's the ascending colon. Whereas number 12 is pointing to the section of the colon that goes directly across. So it's kind of the horizontal part there. And the way that I always remember this, if you remember this was a long time ago, we're thinking about this quarter, this was day 1 of our quarter, we talked about the different planes of the body. If you remember the frontal plane, the sagittal plane, the only horizontal plane that we had was called the transverse plane. Well, this part of the colon is called the transverse colon, if that helps you to remember that term. So number 12 is the transverse colon. Number 13 is then now food is going to travel down, so opposite of ascending is descending. So number 13 is the descending colon. And then number 14 is, the way that I always remember this, if you can see it kind of looks like an S. Well, this part of the colon starts with the letter S. It is called the sigmoid colon. S-I-G-M-O-I-D, sigmoid. And the last stage of digestion would be the food is going to travel through that colon and then move into the rectum here, number 15. The rectum is actually what has those there's muscles that are right there in the rectum that have a signal that's sent to the brain when that, again, those muscles send that reflex up to that signal up to the brain, and then the brain can control the different sphincters that we'll discuss a little bit later, controlling the exit of our feces here. So number 16 is pointing to the opening where that will go through, and that is the anus. Okay. So just going through everything again, just to make sure you guys have everything. Number 1 is the esophagus. Number 2 is the stomach. Number 3 is the duodenum. Number 4 is the liver. Number 5 is the gallbladder. Number 6 is the pancreas. Number 7 is the second part to that small intestine, the jejunum. Number 8 is the third part to that, is the ileum, the third part of that small intestine. Number 9 is the first part of the large intestine, called the cecum. Number 10 is the appendix. Number 11 is in the ascending colon. Number 12 is the transverse colon. Number 13 is the descending colon. Number 14 is the sigmoid colon. Number 15 is the rectum, and number 18 is the anus. So we are going to discuss all of these sections as we slowly travel through this digestive tract. Okay, so we start in the mouth. So the mouth is very important, as our digestion is going to start right away. One, because the mechanical digestion can take place because of what's called mastication. Mastication is simply just another name for chewing. So the teeth are going to be involved in that process of chewing up our food, and so that's just another term for swallowing. For chewing is mastication. I was looking at the word swallowing there. Swallowing can sometimes be referred to as deglutition, if you guys ever hear that term. Deglutition is deglutition. Sorry, I have to write it out. Deglution. If you guys ever see that anywhere or hear that, that's just another term for the process of swallowing. So the tongue is going to be not just involved in moving that food around your mouth, but also aiding in that process of swallowing. So the muscles that are there in our mouth, as well as the tongue, are going to actually make that process take place. And then also in the mouth, we have the chemical digestion that will start to take place right away because of our salivary glands. We have 3 glands that produce saliva in our mouth. One located in our cheek, those are called the parotid glands. Underneath our tongue is the sublingual gland, as you can see in this diagram. And guys, I know this picture is also in your book if you guys want to get a better viewpoint of this. This picture is on page 436. You can see a much better close-up of that. So the parotid glands are in the cheek, the sublingual is underneath the tongue, and then the submandibular is located in our mandible. We know our mandible is our lower jaw, so that term is located in that as well, so you can see that. And all three of those glands are producing saliva. You can see that they have, these are exocrine glands because they have a tube or duct that's going to take that secretion from those glands and place it right into the mouth so that that can take place right away, that chemical digestion. So that is why the mouth is the first stage of digestion there. So the pharynx is involved. What happens when we swallow? Swallow, like I said, deglutition is going to take place because of the tongue and the pharynx and the muscles around that are going to help to push that food down into the pharynx. Remember, the epiglottis will shut on top of the trachea so that food does not travel into the trachea and that it will pass that and go into the esophagus. So it's only in the pharynx for just a brief moment. As soon as we swallow, it's in the throat, and then it's gone. It goes right into the esophagus. There are what's called sphincters in the esophagus, and you can see, we'll see these a little bit closer when we look at the stomach. Anytime you see the term sphincter is simply just a ring of muscles. So I always kind of think about how a fist would look. What happens is, as a fist opens up, there's now a hole in my hand. And that is very similar to how a sphincter works. When you hear the term sphincter, again, just know that that means ring of muscles. But at the very end of the esophagus, we have, that's the main one I really want you guys to remember, is the lower esophageal sphincter. What that does at the end of the esophagus, before we get into the stomach, that sphincter will open up, allow food to travel into the stomach, and then we'll close off again. We'll get a better viewpoint of that when we look at the stomach. So remember, food will travel through the esophagus. No digestion takes place in the stomach. In the esophagus. It is just a passageway to the stomach. Once we get into the stomach, here we're going to see a lot of digestion taking place because of all the chemicals that are present here in the stomach. In the stomach, we're going to see what's called gastric emptying. So it's just, we're going to see lots of chemicals coming from the different cells on the wall of the stomach. I'm going to show you guys that. Very much involved in just digesting this food, mixing it up in the stomach, and eventually it's going to push it out of the stomach and into the small intestine, so that therefore then more digestion can take place and some absorption can take place too. Also in the stomach, we're going to see the secretion of all those fluids, gastric juices, including a very important one called hydrochloric acid. Hydrochloric acid is a very, very powerful acid, but is neutralized in the stomach because of the presence of other fluids and because of the very tough inner lining of our stomach. Is going to make sure that that acid doesn't hurt our stomach. It only is involved in the breakdown of these foods that make its way to the stomach. The stomach creates we've got different gastric hormones and what's called intrinsic factor. You guys don't have to worry about that. I'm not going to ask you guys too much about that. So I wouldn't worry about it, but it's just fluids that are going to help in this process here. It digests a limited amount of food, and then, like I said, from there it's going to push that food out of the stomach, and eventually will go into the small intestine where more absorption and digestion will take place. The stomach also is involved in absorbing certain substances too. All right, so let's take a look at the stomach. There's different sections here of the stomach, but here I wanted to show you guys, here's the lower esophageal sphincter. It is a ring of muscles, and what will happen, it works very, very similar to a valve, that when that food, sometimes referred to as a bolus. If you guys ever see the term bolus, bolus is just the term given to swallowed food. So that term B-O-L-U-S, bolus, just means that, swallowed food. That bolus is going to come into the stomach, but first it has to go through this doorway. Like I said, very similar to a valve, that lower esophageal sphincter will open up, and then it will shut behind the food to make sure that food and stomach acids and things of that nature will not make its way up into the esophagus. It is here that sometimes when that lower esophageal sphincter isn't working properly, sometimes because of spicy foods or other reasons, sometimes it just could be because we're more susceptible to this. Pregnant women are sometimes more susceptible to this, but when that esophageal sphincter doesn't close all the way, sometimes those stomach acids can make its way up into the esophagus, and then we then feel a burning sensation in our esophagus, which, because of where it's located in our chest, we refer to that as heartburn. even though there is nothing in our heart that is burning. It is just, we can feel it in our chest because of where the esophagus is. That's what that is. So that's when the esophageal sphincter sometimes doesn't close all the way. And now there's all kinds of, again, there's medications that can help with heartburn. In some severe cases, some people have had to make nutritional changes or eat sitting up, so that make sure that gravity helps in that process, helps peristalsis for sure. And some people have surgery. In very extreme cases, surgery can help too. Okay, but that's where the lower esophageal sphincter is that I was referring to earlier. So here are the different sections of our stomach. So here's the stomach. The top portion is referred to as the fundus. So you can see this top section up here is the fundus. The main portion of the stomach is referred to as the body of the stomach. And then the very end section is called the pylorus, which is why this last ring of muscles exiting the stomach is referred to as the pyloric sphincter. So very similar to the lower esophageal sphincter, it is a ring of muscles that is going to open to allow passage through and will close to make sure that things don't go the wrong way or exit when they don't need to before, again, it's ready to. So that pyloric sphincter will help with that. These different curvatures, so you can see the stomach curves right here and then curves on the outside. So this smaller curve on the inside is referred to as the lesser curvature. The outer curve is referred to as the greater curvature. And then the inner lining, if you can see, the inside of the stomach looks very wrinkly. I know that sounds kind of strange, but that is because the inner lining of the stomach is made up of what's called rugae or rugae. Rugae, what that does, very similar to how we would see a deflated balloon. We know a deflated balloon is all wrinkly, right? But when we fill it with air, it becomes really smooth. And that's kind of how the stomach works, that as we fill it with different things, as we are eating and we're constantly putting more food into it, it will slowly have that ability to stretch because of the presence of this rugae. Rugae allows it to stretch. If we were looking at a full stomach, that rugae would be all stretched out and we would see kind of a smoother lining of the stomach. But that's what rugae does, is it allows that stomach to expand. We're going to see a very similar inner lining on the bladder too, when we look at that in the next chapter. But those are the different sections of the stomach. Our muscles, guys, I really don't want you guys to worry about the different, see how these muscle layers, you can see they go a little bit different. So that they're the longitudinal, you can see is long ways, the circular muscle layer goes the other way, and then oblique, just looking at muscle. We did not cover that in our muscular system, so I'm not going to ask you guys anything about the difference between longitudinal, oblique, or circular. I really just want you guys to know that the stomach is very much involved in the mixing and mashing of chyme, and that is because of the presence of that muscle. And it's also going to see more peristalsis taking place. Because of that muscle, we're going to see this slow wave-like contraction that's going to slowly push that food out of the stomach as well. If we look at the inner wall of the stomach, we look at this, we cut the inner part of it, you would see, all those different folds or that rugae, but there you can see all these different mucus and parietal and chief cells on the inner lining here. And so they're all different. I'm not going to ask you to tell me which is which because they all look very, very similar. Mucus cells help to produce a mucus layer of our stomach here, which helps to keep it protected. The parietal cells actually help to produce the hydrochloric acid and intrinsic factor, and our chief cells create digestive enzymes. The big thing I want you guys to know in the stomach is that the stomach has all kinds of different things present. So whether you know that as the intrinsic factor or different enzymes or just different fluids, just know that the stomach has all these different fluids, and that's going to really help with digestion to take place here in the stomach. So we're seeing a lot of that chemical digestion occurring here in the stomach. I do want you guys to be familiar with hydrochloric acid though. If I were to ask you guys, what is the name of the acid that's present in the stomach, I do want you guys to know that as hydrochloric acid. It is as I mentioned, a very powerful acid, and so that is why we're going to see a lot of that digestion occurring here in the stomach. Okay. Then we get into the small intestine. Again, we label numbers 3, 7, and 8 on our diagram as the duodenum, the jejunum, and the ileum. The small intestine, guys, is very much involved in helping with more digestion. We're going to see different digestive organs present. Not organs, enzymes present because of how the liver, gallbladder, and the pancreas are attached right there to the small intestine. So we're going to see their secretions helping in this process too. We'll talk about those a little bit further. But we're going to see a lot of absorption occurring here as well. And that is because if we were to cut and look on the inner wall of a small intestine, you would see what's called villi. Each villus, if we were looking at that singular, you would see these little just kind of finger-like projections on the inner wall of the small intestines here. The villi help to increase the surface area for more absorption to take place. Again, as we had just talked about on that previous couple slides, at the stomach, what's happening here in the stomach is we're seeing a lot of mixing and churning and mixing with all those different fluids there in the stomach. What's going to happen is that's going to slowly be pushed out of the stomach through that pyloric sphincter and into the duodenum right here. Because it is mixed with a lot of that mucus and different fluids that are present there in the stomach, this is now very liquidy. Once it's moving through the small intestine, we're going to see more of a liquidy substance. It's mixing with everything that we have taken in. So whether, we've ingested a lot of fluids at the same time as well, but also because of the fluids that are present in the stomach, we're seeing more of a fluid-like, secretion coming out of the stomach. So as it's traveling through the small intestine here, that fluid is running across the entire surface, but hitting more of that surface because the surface isn't just flat. We see all these different raised portions of the small intestine, so we're seeing more areas that fluid can touch, if that makes sense. That's what I mean by the increasing the surface area so that more can be absorbed because there's more parts of the small intestine being touched. Inside each villus, if you can see, here's one villus in this picture down here at the bottom, and you can see very thin layer on that villus. And inside each, we have blood capillaries and lymphatic capillaries present, ready to absorb whatever comes that way so that we can immediately take that into the bloodstream and take that where it needs to go. So inside we see capillaries and lacteals, and that is just ready to absorb that fluid right away. So that's what we're seeing inside the small intestine. So waves of muscle contraction are still going to continue to take place here. Again, that's what peristalsis is waves of muscle contraction and relaxation all along that pathway, slowly pushing that forward. If you remember looking at that overview of the digestive tract, the small intestines weren't just a straight line. The small intestines move up, over, down, around, and so we're really going to be dependent on peristalsis here because gravity isn't something that's going to, gravity, again, like I said, always helps, especially in the esophagus, but because we're moving in such crazy ways, peristalsis is going to help. So that wave is going to, push that forward. So it pushes food from the mouth towards the anus, but the peristaltic movements will differ from organ to organ. So definitely here in the small intestine. Then we move to the large intestine. So remember we labeled number 9 here as the cecum. So that's just the first pouch down here of our large intestine. We know our large intestine just simply frames our small intestine as it goes up, over, down, and then through the sigmoid colon down here. So the colon we labeled as, I don't know why it's bulleted this kind of weird way, but this is all part of the colon. The first part we labeled, again, number 11 as the ascending. Number 10 we called the appendix. You don't have to refer to it as the veriform appendix. Appendix is just fine. But going through the ascending was number 11. Again, number 12 was the transverse. Number 13 was the descending colon. And then number 14 we labeled as the sigmoid colon. So those are the different parts of that colon. So food is going to move as it makes its way out of the large intestine. It's going to meet with the cecum, and that food will go up, over, and down through the colon here through the sigmoid, and then to the rectum, which we labeled as number 15, and then out the anus, which we labeled as number 16. So what is happening here in the large intestine? So it's here that, again, remember I said that that fluid that is leaving the stomach, and as it travels through the large intestine, I can't talk today, guys, I'm sorry, through the small intestine. The small intestine is where a lot of our absorption of a lot of those nutrients is taking place. So it's still very liquidy as it travels through the small intestine. Here, when it makes its way into the large intestine, it is still going to be very liquidy. Here's where we're going to start to absorb some of that water. We're going to start to concentrate this, waste product now, because this is stuff that has not been absorbed, things that can't be absorbed by our body. So now we're going to start to concentrate that and create a stool, so feces. So we're absorbing all of the water from it. So any water and electrolytes that are needed by the body, we can grab that out at this point. At the same time, we're also seeing the synthesis of vitamins by our intestinal bacteria. It is here in the large intestines that we're going to see what's called microbiota, which is our gut bacteria. There is good bacteria and bad bacteria. You guys are going to learn more about this in microbiology. But in microbiology, you guys are going to talk about how the majority of microorganisms in our atmosphere and in our body are actually really good for us. I think a lot of times people hear that term bacteria and they think, oh no, bacteria makes me sick. Not always. Bacteria, we have a lot of bacteria in our large intestine that helps in digestion and helps with the synthesis of vitamins and helps with all kinds. So it's our good gut bacteria. It helps with, processing things the way that they need to be processed. So that's important, and we'll talk a little bit more about that, what's called microbiota there. We're also going to see a temporary storage of this waste. So as we concentrate that feces and create that, we will temporarily store it until it needs to be eliminated. And then lastly, the last function is to eliminate that waste. So feces and then flatus and our gas as well will be eliminated here at this stage. Okay, there we go. So again, we're still continuing to see the process of peristalsis. So muscle movement will move fecal material from the cecum all the way through the colon. Again, especially since we know it's going up, over, it's going, up, over, and down. And so we're really going to be dependent on that peristalsis to help push that forward. Constipation and diarrhea is affected here in the large intestines. We know constipation is when someone has difficulty going to the restroom caused by numerous different things, but we're going to see kind of a buildup here in the colon. So that's why different things are often given to stool softeners or laxatives, something of that nature, to make that move forward. Whereas diarrhea, on the opposite end, what happens here, diarrhea is also caused by a number of different things. But in the case that, let's say, for instance, diarrhea is caused by a bacteria, say some type of stomach bug, what happens is our body sometimes wants to remove as fast as possible this foreign bacteria that shouldn't be present. There's good bacteria, and there is bad bacteria. When that bad bacteria is making us sick, it sometimes gives us diarrhea. And what happens is it causes that what normally will move slowly through the large intestine as we are slowly absorbing that water, instead, if it moves very quickly through the large intestine, it will then instead not have the chance, our body will not have the chance to absorb that water, and that is why our elimination is diarrhea. So again, caused by all kinds of different things, but it is the large intestine that is affected when we are, when we or a patient is experiencing constipation or diarrhea. Different medications given for both, or changes in nutrition, whatever it might be that is causing these issues. And as I mentioned, microbiota, good to be familiar with, as again, it is our good gut bacteria. People oftentimes take probiotics to help aid with that and give more to our gut bacteria, as that is something that helps very much so with our digestion. Okay. There we go. Our accessory organs, again, we labeled as 4, 5, and 6 on our diagram. Our liver, and then tucked underneath it is the gallbladder, and then we're going to see the pancreas. And the main thing I want you guys to know from these accessory structures is they're called accessory because they sit outside of our digestive tract. But I also want you guys to be familiar with the fact that they create different substances to help in this digestion. So let's talk about that. So the liver does a lot of different things. The liver is a very, 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 very valuable organ for our body. We need our liver. And we need it to be working properly. The liver, the main thing I want you guys to focus on what the liver does is right up there at the top, that the synthesis of bile salts, but the secretion of what's called bile. What is bile? Bile is a fluid that this fluid will be secreted out of the liver and will go directly into the small intestine. Bile helps in what's called the emulsification of fats. That bile helps to take our large fat molecules and break them down into smaller ones. That's what the term emulsify means. It means take larger things and break them down into smaller. Just like in a blender, we can emulsify ice. We put large ice cubes into a blender and they become smaller when we emulsify. That's what emulsifying does. So bile helps to emulsify fats, and that helps our body to process that fat a little bit easier. So that's what's happening there. The rest, again, like I said, that's the main thing I want you guys to be familiar with the liver. The liver is very important in that it helps to synthesize plasma proteins, storage of glucose. We call it glycogen in the storage form, but we store glucose so that we can have that on reserve for energy should we need that later. That's where glucagon is going to come in. If you guys remember talking about glucagon, glucagon is the hormone created by the pancreas. When the pancreas secretes that, it targets the liver and tells the liver to release that storage that we have of glucose so that we can use that in the event that we need extra energy. So just a heads up on that. So storage of glucose as well as fat-soluble vitamins helps our body to detox. It is the main organ for drug detoxification. So if we have drugs of any sort in our body, then our liver is what is helping to get that out of our system. Whether it's antibiotics or alcohol, whatever it might be, our body is going to be detoxified because of the liver. Excretion of what's called bilirubin, cholesterol, as well as drugs, so it helps our body to eliminate these. The metabolism of our carbs, fats, and proteins will take place here, as well as phagocytosis will also take place here. So because our liver is very much involved in helping to detoxify, it helps with that process there. Again, the main thing to really focus on is the word bile here, that the liver, because we're talking about digestion, it is important to be familiar with how important the liver is and what it does. And we need it, again, because of all of these different functions. But the main thing I want to focus on here is its substance that helps with digestion, since we're talking about the digestive tract. So bile. It is the hepatic portal system. What happens is end products of digestion will flow through the portal vein and will go to the liver. The liver processes these end products. So again, when I say end products, I mean carbs will be broken down into glucose, fats are broken down into fatty acids, proteins are broken down into amino acids, and all of these things will go through the vein into the liver, and the liver will process these end products of digestion, helping to discharging blood through hepatic veins and into the vena cava, so that they're processed now and we're able to process these and then put these into our circulatory system. So that's what I mean by the hepatic portal system, that these end products of digestion are actually going to flow through the liver. The gallbladder is that pear-shaped organ that is directly underneath the liver. Its job and its main thing that I want you guys to focus on is this one right here, that it concentrates and it stores bile. It is going to be what, again, just hangs on to extra bile that the liver has created. And in the event that we need more bile, it's going to help to release some. Both the liver and the gallbladder are attached to what's called the common bile duct by the cystic duct, which we're going to see the addition of the pancreas here. But that bile is going to then be able to exit and go into the duodenum, into the small intestine. Like I said, be familiar with that. It talks a little bit about, more that it does at fat and the in the duodenum stimulates, and how it does that, it stimulates the release of what's called CCK. That causes the gallbladder to contract, which will in turn eject bile into that common bile duct into the duodenum, helping to then, we know bile will then, its job is to emulsify those fats. So that's how that works. The gallbladder is an organ that we can live without. The gallbladder is sometimes susceptible to gallstones. And when somebody does get gallstones, typically it's just an easy surgery to have that gallbladder removed. In the event that the gallbladder is removed, the liver, recognizes the loss of that gallbladder and will produce bile as it's needed. All right, and the pancreas, located just below the stomach. Again, remember, it is going to be involved in both our endocrine and exocrine functions. The endocrine system we talked about in chapter 14. We talked about the pancreas's creation of insulin and glucagon. Here, simply just know that the pancreas creates pancreatic enzymes. There's juices created in the pancreas that will be secreted directly into the duodenum, and that will again help in the process of digestion. Talks a little bit in more detail how it talks about digestive enzymes. The pancreas will also secrete what's called alkaline juice, rich in a certain substance called bicarbonate, which helps to neutralize the highly acidic chyme. And I'm sorry, I meant to mention this to you guys earlier. I mentioned to you guys when we swallow food, how sometimes you might see that referred to as a bolus, that we call that food a bolus as it travels through the digestive tract. When it moves into the stomach, it mixes with all those fluids. And I mentioned that once it leaves the stomach, it is going into the duodenum there, but right there, when it leaves the stomach, it's very fluid-like. It's very liquidy at this point. So now this is referred to as what's called chyme. So when you see that term chyme, that's all that is just that fluid that's coming from the stomach now. Because it is coming from the stomach, it is very acidic, and the juices that are coming from the pancreas right at that same location are opposite of acidic, which is what's called alkaline, which is going to help to neutralize that as it then travels the rest of the way through the small intestine. But the main thing to know is that pancreas creates pancreatic juices that contains enzymes that are going to help with digestion. That's all you guys really need to know. I really just want you guys to know that the liver, gallbladder, and pancreas are accessory organs outside of the digestive tract, and their secretions help to assist in digestion. I would know that the liver and the gallbladder are helping with creating a bile, and bile helps with the destruction of fats, whereas the pancreas, just know that they create, the pancreas, or not they, that the pancreas creates juices containing enzymes that are going to help to break that down. Okay, and lastly, guys, there's a couple things that I have cut out of this. I actually cut out this section 3 here, going into the physiology of digestion. We've talked a little bit about that already as it moves through, but I didn't get into the specifics of these different enzymes. I really didn't think that that was necessary. It talks about that's anything that ends in ASE. Whenever you see that ACE, it is a specific enzyme, and I thought we were getting too deep into the chemistry of it, and we had skipped over some of the chemistry. I want to just stick with anatomy and physiology. So we've kind of talked a little bit about both of that, both the anatomy and the physiology of the digestive tract as we've gone through it. But I do want to end with the nutrition here. That nutrition is the study of the relationship of food to the body function. You guys will take a class dedicated to nutrition, so you guys will talk very heavily about this information. But there are five categories of nutrients. Carbs, fats, and proteins, or lipids, just means fats, are what we take in, our different sources of food. And then a lot of these foods contain certain vitamins and minerals. So vitamins that you may be familiar with, there's vitamin A, there's vitamin B, there's vitamin D, vitamin E, vitamin K. There's all kinds of different vitamins out there, and a lot of them all serve different functions for our body, and they all serve important purposes. But we find them in different foods. And like I said, in nutrition, you guys will talk about that. And minerals, some examples of minerals would be things like calcium or sodium, fluoride. There's all kinds of different minerals as well, but again, different food sources contain these different vitamins and minerals, and they are important for the body. Carbs themselves, and this is something I briefly mentioned earlier, carbs can be broken down into simple carbs or complex carbs. Your simple carbs are more so your sugars. So I know that they mentioned, and this is getting a little chemistry, so you guys do not need to know that they're your monosaccharides and disaccharides. Don't worry about that. But just know simple sugars are typically things like candies, cookies, things like white bread, white pastas. Those are typically the carbs that you want to stay away from. Now, not that white bread is as bad as a cookie. That's, again, contains a whole lot more sugar, but those are what I mean by simple sugars. Whereas complex carbohydrates primarily consist of things like starches and fibers. So you're finding things in like the skin of potato is really good for you, fibers, grains. Most carbohydrate consumption, as it mentions there in that last bullet point, should be in this form as opposed to the simple sugar form. Proteins, as far as proteins, there's what's called essential amino acids and non-essential amino acids. Essential amino acids are not synthesized by the body, meaning that our body does not necessarily create that, so we have to consume that and get that from our diet. Whereas the term non-essential is something that is created by our body, so it's not really essential for us to consume that. We can find these types of amino acids in either what's called complete proteins or incomplete proteins. So our complete proteins are called complete, but because it contains all of our essential amino acids needed for our diet, whereas incomplete does not. Most of your complete proteins are coming from your animal sources, so things like meat-based products, things of that nature, like eggs and chicken and turkey and beef, whereas then incomplete protein we're typically finding in your plant-based protein, so beans, nuts, and lentils. Now, so for those that are vegan or vegetarian, does that mean that they are not getting all of the essential amino acids that they need? No, that's not necessarily true, because what a vegetarian can do, because they do not typically reach for these animal sources of proteins, they in turn can actually eat some incomplete proteins together, and that will create, the addition of those together will help to bring that all those essential amino acids together. So don't think that because vegetarians and vegans are typically eating incomplete proteins that their diet is incomplete. That's usually a myth that I think some people believe when they hear that. But again, vegetarians who eat beans and are also eating nuts and lentils, and like I said, that the things that are eaten together, typically they are then reaching their complete diet, and that's okay. Fats, then we have lots of different categories of fats. Saturated fats are solid at room temperature, whereas your unsaturated fats are oil are liquid at room temperature. So things like your vegetable oils and olive oils and things of that nature, whereas your saturated fats, you see those, we know that things like more like butter and margarines are more solid. So that's kind of getting a visual of the difference here. Essential fatty acids are not synthesized by the body, and these must be consumed. A lot of times when we think of essential fatty acids, oftentimes think of things like your omega-3s. People take fish oil to try and get these essential fatty acids into their body, as those things are typically pretty good for you. There are a lot of people that tend to want to stay away from fats, but there are certain fats that are very good for us. Again, olive oil as opposed to margarine is going to be much better for you. Like I said, taking omega-3 supplements is very good for your fish oil. That type of fat is very good for you. Avocados are a vegetable that contains some fats, but it is a very good fat. So don't think that fats are just really bad when you say, oh, completely away from them. The thing that you really need to avoid is what's called trans fats. Trans fats are, if you ever see those on the label, typically that's something to stay away from. We see some of those typically in like baked goods. And this just shows the process of using a bile, as we talked about in the liver, that the secretion of bile from the liver takes these large fat globules, these types of molecules, and breaks them down into tiny fat molecules, and that actually makes those easier to process, because then we have different enzymes that come in through the pancreas. So it talks about secretion of pancreatic lipase into the intestines will help to break that down even further, and we can absorb these molecules now through the wall of the small intestine into, again, there's the how it's showing the movement into the villus, and that's going to help to absorb that a whole lot easier. Vitamins, these are small organic molecules that help to regulate cell metabolism. Different things are needed by different vitamins. So we have what's called fat-soluble vitamins. So typically these are, they're just easier to be absorbed with the presence of fat. So vitamins A, D, E, K, all of these can be stored by the body because they're fat soluble, so it's easier for us to absorb that. Whereas water-soluble vitamins, that simply means that they're going to be absorbed in water and in liquids. So these are typically eliminated pretty quickly. So if you take vitamin supplements, sometimes these particular vitamins are removed from our body pretty quickly. So vitamins B and C are your water-soluble vitamins. Like I said, you're going to talk about all of these in your nutrition class as well. But it's good to be familiar with some of these intro concepts to nutrition. And then minerals. Minerals are inorganic substances that are also needed for normal body function. So a couple examples would be like sodium and chloride. The two of them are listed there together because that is salt. Table salt is actually the combination of sodium and chloride. Typically, we're able to get a pretty significant amount of sodium and chloride in our diet because salt is pretty much in all of our food. Potassium is important. Finding things like bananas and potato skins are, contain lots of potassium. Calcium, phosphorus, magnesium, iron, iodine, and then we have trace elements, which are just minerals that we need in small amounts. But those are just some examples of some of our minerals. You don't have to, know specifics about these or what each of those will do for our body. And you don't have to know where we find these. These are just examples, and just to kind of be familiar with our different nutritional categories. So a balanced diet is really important. So a poorly balanced diet can result in disease. So diet high in cholesterol or fat, or even both, has been implicated in coronary artery disease. If you remember, we talked about in our blood chapter, we talked about in our discussion the importance of diet and exercise because of the fact that sometimes fat deposits can lead to what's called atherosclerosis, which is the buildup of fat deposits on the inner wall of our arteries. And we definitely don't want that because then it leads to blockages. So coronary artery disease, which blockages can then in turn result in stroke, diabetes, and even cancer. So a healthy diet is definitely important. And I only stress this because this is something that you guys will eventually stress to your patients. You'll find that it's amazing how much nutrition plays a huge role in health. And so that's something that you will want to take and make sure that you're, then showing that and advising your patients of that as well. Okay, so that is it for chapter 23. So I hope that helps with that chapter. If you guys have any questions, please just let me know.